both of you sort of deal with various technologies and the way that they might shape identity. So Chris, you sort of spoke of, the census and state classificatory systems, but also digital ancestral databases, the proliferation of people using Ancestry.ca in order to claim indigeneity. And Robin, in your work of technologies of breastfeeding and sort of milk circulation, and how these technologies kind of operate in the making of identity. So I'm wondering, what role do technologies play? How do they matter in sort of producing, managing, or reimagining identity, and to what effect?
In terms of technologies, I think the kind of practices of the self that I've been thinking through are kinds of technologies. There's very broad ways that we can understand technologies. That anytime we sign our name, that's a form of technology. And then if we think about sort of technological innovations and how that can affect how we think about identity. Certainly, like if we're thinking about social media and ways in which we're virtually representing ourselves, different kinds of technological interventions into our bodies that can enable different kinds of bodily practices, and that therefore can produce new forms and new understandings of identities, and also new ways of sharing or exchanging ideas about identities with others.
For me, one of the interesting things about the way that technology has operated in the context that I was talking about was that it removes the ability of Indigenous peoples to tell stories about ourselves that are connected to place. So in other words, censuses, as maybe some or most of you know, censuses aren't particular ways of collecting information that's out there. They're particular lenses for looking at the world. Bruce Curtis talks about this in his brilliant book, Politics of Population, the ways in which these operate as lenses and kind of discipline this otherwise undifferentiated mass of humanity. And I think for me, one of the things that technology does is it allows people to make claims in such a way that doesn't require them to talk to other Indigenous people and doesn't require them to think about their relationality to the place that they live in. So if you think about a lot of these new quote-unquote Métis folks in Eastern Quebec and the Maritimes who are making these claims to indigeneity, there's already people whose territory they're on, already Indigenous people whose territories they're on, who have these kind of storied relationships to place. And so when they use things like the census to make these arguments, there's no need to build that kind of relationality. All they're really doing is reproducing the way in which the state categorizes these things that they're talking about. And so I find that hugely problematic.
On that note, do you think that there are ways that technologies can be deployed to form collective identities and to kind of resist?
Oh yeah, for sure. It's been a while since I kind of been in sociological circles, but you guys know what Idle No More is? So Idle No More, okay, wow, I don't know. A couple years ago, Idle No More comes out. I don't know if any of you were at the big round dance that they did at West Ed Mall, that 3,000 people come out to the round dance. That doesn't happen if the core of Idle No More is happening on particular First Nations. You've got nearly 80,000 people living in Edmonton, and it only took 2 tweets out into the Twitterverse, which then got picked up on Facebook, to produce this collective form of solidarity in the form of the round dance at West Ed Mall. So of course it's both enabling and kind of oppressive, but for me, I'm not so much interested in the enabling elements, because that's all fucking anybody ever talks about, is the enabling elements of it. I'm interested in looking at, okay, well, wait a minute. Sure, this is enabling, but what are we missing when we take these things as kind of just neutral, technical tools to help us?
So I think in a lot of ways, both of you sort of engage with this concept of relationality. And so I'm wondering about the idea of the other, or of the sort of intersubjective process of self-other. And whether or not you see that as sort of necessary or not in this theorizing of identity, and why or why not that might be.
Yes, obviously it's necessary. Specifically in an Indigenous context, given that kind of the wound that doesn't heal in liberal nation states is kind of the story that liberal nation states tell themselves about kind of their innate goodness and what have you. And colonialism is fundamentally predicated on kind of having another, which you're not, in order to kind of to make you who you are. So it's certainly fundamental to the construction of kind of the discursive horizons around indigeneity, but I think there's in some ways something, I don't know if it's more interesting, but something kind of more complex going on. When you're getting non-Indigenous people who are making claims to being Indigenous, they are self-identifying as the other themselves. So in other words, if someone's making a claim to being Indigenous, they have an ancestor, from 300 years ago or something, what they often do is they'll kind of put their toe in the water on Twitter or on Facebook just to see kind of what people have to say, and their narrative builds up over time. And when you call them on it and say, oh, that's interesting, who's your family now, those kinds of things, then there's this immediate kind of victim shield comes up, and they feel like they're being othered by Indigenous people because we're not kind of going with the discourse that they're using. So, I mean, othering is kind of at one fairly straightforward level crucial to this discussion, but it's also interesting the way in which the victimology of these this white possessiveness plays itself out in terms of chucking this cloak of otherness on themselves as well.
I've been very much influenced by the work of Emmanuel Levinas in thinking about identity as well, where he, with some reservations about his political pronouncements, but the way in which he thinks about subjectivity or identity as from even before the foundation of the self having a relationship with the other, that it's actually the encounter with alterity that gives rise to the subject or the self or identity itself. So thinking about how identity is always from the very beginning, or even before the beginning of the self, involved in a relation or an encounter with difference. That's been pretty foundational in terms of how I think about the relationship between the other and identity. And in terms of thinking about identity as becoming, there is no becoming without difference, and so there's always this relationship with difference or with the other.
One thing that I find interesting is that in some ways both of you sort of engage with biology and embodied phenomena. So even sort of Kim Tallbear's work speaks to this in terms of DNA and claims to indigeneity through that. And Robin, in your attention to breastfeeding and sort of, the embodied self. So I guess the question is, what about biology? Under what circumstances does biology matter?
Determinism is always, or reductionism is always sort of the danger when you're thinking about biology and its relationship with identity. So that's always something that I'm wary about. What biology gets used for symbolically in terms of how the identity of the self and others is when it's seen to be reliant or dependent on some kind of underlying biology is often used as sort of a shorthand to shut down on the possibilities for transformation and change and to reify sort of social and political inequalities. So that's always the risk with biology. And then I think also there's a risk on the other side of not taking biology seriously, not taking matter seriously, thinking of identity as purely symbolic, as purely linguistic, as purely something that can be subject to endless and infinite transformation, and not recognizing that that we have bodies, and that the bodies that we have and the ways that they're shaped by our experiences and our environments and other people are very much part of who we are.
Yeah, I would say very much in agreement with that. In fact, it's interesting to me that you use the term biology rather than race, because those two things are used almost coterminously in most of the discussion that happens around these kinds of issues. And so you get this kind of narrative in which people will say, we'll use scientific discourses to say, well, biological notions of race aren't real. And we can see that they're not real because when various colonial officials come to what is now called Canada, they found that race didn't work. It didn't kind of match the complexity of what they were dealing with. And it's just such a really silly way to think about this. Race isn't just about biology. Race has never been just about biology. And when we reduce race to biology, we're missing out on all those different complex ways and all those different ways in which these social dynamics come together in particular places to privilege some people and oppress other people. So if you look at Western Canada in the 19th century, or what becomes Western Canada, it's never just about biology. It's moral comportment, it's the type of labor that you're involved in. All of these different things come together in this kind of this administrative ball through which they then attempt to kind of untangle what they see as being the relationships between British subjects and people who aren't British subjects. And so I think biology is reductive on the one hand, but again, to say in support of what you're saying, it's also really important not to erase biology as a basis for thinking about indigeneity. It's what these kind of purely symbolic claims, as you talk about it, are actually doing. They're saying, well, biology doesn't matter. And you say, okay, well, sure, biology isn't causative necessarily of anything, but it certainly is highly correlated with a bunch of different things that we think about when we think about indigeneity. And I remember Kim Tallbear once, who's a Canada Research Chair in the Faculty of Native Studies, someone put a chart up. There's this famous chart in the United States of blood quantum. So everyone kind of reacts in horror with blood quantum and thinks it's so disgusting that we could cut humans up into these different categories of blood. And she kind of said, well, it's really interesting that people look at that and they see fractions. When I look at them, I see relatives. So what is it when someone becomes more fractional as they move away for various reasons? So I guess what I'm saying is that even though biology isn't causative, it is correlational. And so when we think about biology, if we think about it in a causative sense, fine, that's a problem. But if we think about it as kind of this epistemological correlation or coming together of a lot of these different kinds of social dynamics, it has quite a lot to say about particular kinds of issues. And so this is why it becomes intensely problematic around things like the census and DNA, because they remove all of that complexity.
Does it have a place, or should it have a place sort of in claims to fluid or multiple identities, and what that place might be?
That's a really important question in terms of gender identity. How do we understand the relationship between gender, sexual difference, and biology? Because there's a long history of taking a very simplistic understanding of sexual difference and just dividing the world into two halves and assuming that there are clear-cut biological differences between those two groups of people. And increasingly we're seeing that it's a lot more complicated and that there's a wide range of biological variation between individuals. The way in which we think about biology is also very much shaped by social structures of inequality. There's a tendency to see biology as inert or passive in contrast to what's social or cultural, rather than recognizing that biology changes in relation to social influences as well, and that biology responds to what we do and our environments and our interactions with people as well.
I would say it depends. So in an Indigenous context, biology, as I said earlier, can be an interesting kind of correlation or way to think about correlation between different sets of dynamics, but there are lots of people in our communities that are adopted in. Mm-hmm. And so in those particular cases, culture plays a role in a different way than it would if you were kind of born and raised in a particular community and come from a particular community. One of the really interesting things about the way that biology operates in an academic context is we don't often talk to give you an example, I have one of my former students who's now on a doctoral fellowship here in the Faculty of Native Studies, Jessica Kolopenik, did this brilliant MA thesis looking at the ways in which race gets constructed through biology in various types of court cases, and the ways in which biology and patriarchy intersect with each other in the construction of ideas around what it means to be a status Indian. We got into a discussion about why, whether or not biology was an important indicator of indigeneity, and at the time she wasn't sure that it was and was really confused that I thought it was, and she sort of intimated to me that she couldn't understand how someone who'd been in academia for as long as I had could be so wrong about something as you do as a PhD student, because fratricide is kind of the order of the day. But it was really interesting because her point was that biology impacts particular state categorizations of indigeneity, but it doesn't necessarily have to have to categorize the way in which communities think about themselves and their relationships to each other. So she had a much more fluid understanding of the role of biology in that. And I was trying to get her to think about the ways, as Indigenous people, we become very heavily invested in state categories, which is why when we fill out the census, for example, we can look at the way that they measure indigeneity, and we can check off where we think we at least partly fit. Because it's very often when you go to community and have these kinds of discussions in community, it's equally sophisticated, but it's a much different set of kind of epistemological a prioris that you get into these conversations with them about. And the toughest questions I've ever gotten asked in any of the talks that I've ever given, and hopefully that still remains the case after today, is going to community and giving presentations on things where you have to translate what you're talking about in a way that mostly makes sense to people who are reading similar things, to then go into a particular situation where people haven't read any of the stuff that you're talking about, but they're still really smart, really critical people, and then trying to get them to think beyond that.
You sort of alluded to this before, but I think it's interesting because it jumps off of that point of sort of relationship to place and claims to territory and how that fits in with what you just said. I'm wondering how temporality and spatiality figure into your work on identity. So here, Robin, I'm thinking kind of on this, this act of becoming and sort of transhistorical shifts and dominant notions of identity, but also Chris in this idea of, again, claims to territory and the importance of place in indigeneity.
I guess I'm enough of a recovering socio-legal scholar to believe that it's really important when we're thinking and talking about indigeneity to think not necessarily in a context of indigeneity, but certainly in a pre-colonial context of indigeneity. So when we think about relationship to place and the relationship between identity and place, to me it's really important that we be thinking historically about where those claims are coming from and what those claims are rooted in. Because one of the things that you see, as I was saying earlier, is that many of these new claims to place are effectively treating the place where they are as terra nullius, as though there aren't actually Indigenous people who are already living there and who have that kind of embodied relationship to that territory, to that place.
And I think, too, in terms of temporality and spatiality, that there are new and different possibilities for forms of becoming in terms of sex and gender. There's different opportunities and different limitations at different times and different places. And when we're thinking about place and time, we can think about language as well, because I was thinking a lot about how debates around pronouns in North America and in English are very different from how conversations are happening around gender identity in French, just because of the way in which language shapes possibilities for expressing identity. And also, I mean, space, but also kind of virtual spaces too, because I was, the way in which Facebook now has something like 57 different possibilities for describing your gender in your Facebook profile. That sort of virtual space, that kind of encounter with others and in terms of self-representation, there are new and different opportunities and also limitations as a result.
I want to come back to sort of this idea of reimagining identity. Both of you in some ways kind of grapple with this idea of how can we deploy a different language that captures what it is that we're trying to really talk about. So I'm wondering your final thoughts on sort of the usefulness of the term identity, and how do we keep it open to sort of constant change and contestation in the ways that are needed, and where should we go with it?
One obstacle or one hesitation that I think we always have to keep in mind is drawing comparisons between different forms of identity, because the way that we think about gender identity is and needs to be different from how we think about racialized identity, different kinds of identity rooted in various other kinds of community. So I think we need to be cautious of being too reductionistic in terms of how we think about identity in different social modes, and recognizing that they have different histories and different trajectories, and that there's what might present itself as an opportunity for something transgressive or transformative in one identity category would have different kinds of opportunities and challenges in other forms of identity.
I would repeat what I said earlier in terms of differentiating between identity as a category of analysis and a category of practice. And since I use so much Bourdieu so often, I tend to think of in terms of habitus and social field. And so I'm interested in, again, in support of what you're saying, the way in which the notion of something like identity operates in the context of, say, the census field, as opposed to how it might operate in the juridical field and those kinds of things. And so I think it's really important empirically to figure out kind of what it is that you're talking about, and the way in which using a term like identity allows you to get at the things that you actually want to get at while you're doing the work. I would encourage everybody here, if you've never done so before, anytime that you write a paper for anything that has anything to do with identity, just do as a thought experiment. Try and remove the use of identity out of that paper that you're doing and try and put other things in, because it's really instructive for what you thought you meant when you use the term identity, and then you look at it, you're like, holy shit, I guess I didn't actually mean that. Or, that's interesting, I used it here, but then I used it here too, but those seem to be two very different things that I'm talking about. So it's really useful, even if you end up going back to using the term identity, and Craig Calhoun has a really interesting criticism of Brubaker and Cooper's discussion to move away from identity. So I think for me, it becomes like a time and space thing about whether it actually makes sense to use it. I tend not to use it because I find that it obfuscates more in the context of the kinds of things that I'm looking at than it actually helps us to kind of actually analytically reveal.
Yeah, I tend not to use it too, actually. I think about, maybe it's sort of one of those categories that are sort of an open space. You want to be very careful what you put in there. And you will also want to be very careful that it's not just a vacant space, that you recognize that there's processes at work, and to try to really get at what's happening in terms of the processes or the production of identity.
Yeah, and that you're not being lazy. So
Yeah.
it ends up being this lens. It's just like this really easy way to think and talk about things. And it's all too easy to fall into, especially if you're used to working with a particular set of literature. You talk with other colleagues that read kind of the same kind of literature, then you get these kind of blinders on as you're going forward. Yeah.